This is the second video in the series of 7 that are dedicated to looking at some of the issues that classical liberalism brought about. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at the grass movements. Protests against the effects of classical liberalism and capitalism were many, and in fact very varied. Not all of these developed into ideologies, though, but they embodied the general discontent of the times among various groups of people. Many of these protests actually also became violent, which, according to Karl Marx, is necessary if one wants to create political change. The focus for the next 3 videos is going to be the question posed in the blue bubble. Why did ideologies develop in opposition to classical liberalism? So by the early 19th century in England, a group of workers band together and they called themselves Luddites. The Luddites protested against manufacturers who used machines in what they called a fraudulent and deceitful manner to get around standard labor practices. Luddites feared that the time spent learning their skill and their craft would go to waste because machines would replace their labor. Many Luddites were actually owners of workshops that had closed down because big factories came and would sell the same products for much cheaper. So these people, they formed a movement and they called themselves the Luddites. This movement began in England and it culminated in a region-wide rebellion that actually lasted for 5 years, from 1811 to 1816. Owners of factories and mills took to shooting these protesters, and eventually the movement was suppressed with legal and military force. Another grassroots movement that began in England was Chartism. Chartism took its name from the People's Charter of 1838, and it was a national protest movement that focused on political reform and universal suffrage. Suffrage means the right for everyone to have a vote. This photograph is actually a real photograph of one of their meetings in London in 1848. The voting or electoral system had been reformed in Britain, at which time the vote had been extended to some of the male middle classes, but not to members of the working classes, and definitely not to women. The right to vote was considered the key to all kinds of improvements for the working class if only they were able to get their hands on it. So people came together in support of Chartism as a way to modify what they considered to be one of the undesirable effects of classical liberalism. The goals of this movement were very popular in the working classes, and in fact petitions were signed by millions of working people, and the signatures were collected and presented to the House of Commons. The strategy employed was to use the scale of support by the millions to put pressure on the politicians. The House of Commons, however, rejected the charter by a vote of 235 to 46. When some of the Chartist leaders threatened to call a general strike, they were arrested and imprisoned. The significance of the Chartists lies in their demonstration of the discontent that gripped working class Britain at the time. The government saw them as an unruly mob, reminiscent of the French Revolution. Most of their demands, however, were eventually implemented in the Reform Acts of 1867 and 1884. So these grassroots movements were definitely important on a political level. Alas, they didn't have the impact socially in nations outside of England that were also experiencing the negative impacts of classical liberalism. Bigger, more influential ideologies needed to come about to develop counter effects of classical liberalism. One ideology that attempted to solve the problem of economic inequality was socialism. This is the ideology that we're going to discuss in our following video.